In this video, I will explore the Battle of Kadesh, which is one of the oldest recorded battles in human history. It is a Bronze Age battle between the two Goliaths of the age, the Egyptians led by Ramses II and the Hittite Empire under Muwatallis. The Battle of Kadesh took place in 1274 BCE in Mesopotamia near modern-day Syria between the Empire of Egypt, which controlled northeastern Africa, the Sinai Peninsula, and Cannae near modern-day Syria. The Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia all the way to Mesopotamia bordering the Egyptian Empire. The two were on a collision course for a Colossus Bronze Age military engagement and the largest recorded chariot battle in military history. Ramses sought to recapture the Hittite-held city of Kadesh, which was located near the Orontes River. The Egyptians, under Ramses, invaded Hittite territory with 3 army divisions, 1, Ra, 2, Amun, 3, Ta. The Egyptian vanguard was Ra, totaling 20,000 troops and 2,000 chariots. Unbeknownst to the Egyptians, the Hittites were on the move south and had scouts looking out for an Egyptian attack. The Hittites were on the move with 30,000 to 40,000 troops and 3,000 chariots. The Egyptian camp opposed the Hittite camp across the Orontes River. The Egyptian camp was occupied by Army Division Amun. The vanguard was trailing behind near the fork in the river by Kadesh, with Ta division trailing not far behind. The Hittite army smashed into the Egyptian vanguard, and Ramses's troops scattered. The savage surprise attack on the Ra division gave the Hittites the idea that the battle was over. After scattering the Ra vanguard, the Hittites began plundering and lowered their defense. The Egyptians, under Ramses, with part of his army still on the move, he reorganized his troops with Amun and Ta and mounted a counteroffensive against the Hittites. Ramses and the Egyptians were able to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. The battle was significant for its continued influence on modern-day military history. It gives insight into warfare in the Bronze Age, and it depicts how chariots and the wheel had a massive impact on civilization. The outcome is so inconclusive that 15 years later, the two sides agreed to return Kadesh to the Egyptians. This is the oldest recorded peace treaty or non-aggression pact in history. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, share, comment, or subscribe, as it would be a great help and keep you notified of new content. Thermopylae, 480 BCE, was a battle in central Greece at a mountain pass known as the Hot Gates in Thermopylae. It was arguably the most famous battle of the Second Greco-Persian Wars. It was between a coalition of Theban, Athenian and Spartan Greeks against the weight of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The Greeks numbered 7,000 soldiers from Thebes, and Sparta. Herodotus, seen as the father of history, along with modern historians estimate that the Persian army totaled 70,000 to 300,000. Herodotus's account of the battle is crucial as it serves as the primary account of the battle. There was one narrow pass through Thermopylae, which was the Persians' route to Inner Greece. Because of this, the Persians had to defeat the Greeks at the narrow pass or Hot Gates. The pass was also bordered by a long path with an edge to the sea. This is to say the Persians faced the Greeks in front, the mountains to the west, and the ocean cliffs to the east. The main objective of the Greek force was to hold off the Persian army for as long as possible in order to give time to the Greek city-states to adequately form a defense and unite against a common enemy. For 7 days, the Greeks held out against the Persians. During 3 of these days, the Persians threw the full weight of the Persian army at the defenders. Eventually, Ephialtes revealed a secret path around the narrow pass to the Persians. Once the Greeks became aware of this, they formed a rearguard that would fight until death. The rearguard that was to stay was famously composed of 300 Spartans, 700 Thebians, and 900 Helots. The remaining Greeks abandoned their defensive position and moved forward into the open in order to meet the Persians head-on. Also, knowing their rear was exposed due to Ephialtes' betrayal, they did not want to risk being secretly attacked from behind, so a position away from the narrow pass where they could see all enemies from every direction. The Greeks fought until death, and the most famous of them was the king of the Spartans, King Leonidas. The sacrifice of the Greeks served to galvanize and inspire the Greek population into action and unity. The Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE is significant because the concept of Hellenism and Greek democracy was in its infancy at the time of the Persian invasion. Although Persia was a vast confederation of satraps, each one was controlled by a ruler that was viewed as a deity or god. The Persian view of rulership extended beyond the divine right of rule to Bronze Age ideas that the ruler was a god. In contrast, the Greeks in Athens had come up with the concept of democracy. A system, in theory, where each person would get a vote on a topic and rules in society would be dictated by such forms of voting. In Plato's Republic, he offers the concept that each voter could and should be represented by someone who is either elected or born, because of their access to knowledge, to rule. It is important to note that the Greek city-states often warred with each other, and Thermopylae is also significant because the Greeks united to fight this oppressive system of tyranny. They could have accepted Persian rule and been Persian satraps, but their views on governance, autonomy, and self-cultivation vastly differed. The Battle at Thermopylae will forever go down as one of the most epic last stands in history at a time when Western democracy was in its infancy. The sacrifice has inspired countless acts of courage against the odds over the subsequent millennia. There is no doubt that it will continue to be remembered as one of the most courageous last stands in the pantheon of military history. If you enjoyed the video, please like, share, or subscribe, as it would be a great help and notify you of new content.
Salutations! In this video, we will be looking at the events leading up to the Battle of Cannae, and the battle itself. Few generals have achieved such audacious military success against overwhelming odds. One such general was Hannibal Barca, whose name was etched in history alongside Caesar, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and Scipio. Hannibal was the son of the Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, leader of the Barcid family, and general during the First Punic War, where Carthage and Rome fought for supremacy in the Mediterranean. The First Punic War lasted for 23 years from 264 BCE to 241 BCE, with most of the fighting being naval engagements, making it the longest continuous naval war in the history of mankind. The First Punic War significantly weakened Carthage's naval power and depleted its coffers. To compound the effect, Rome imposed stringent post-war sanctions and regulations on Carthage. The defeat at the hands of Rome was something Hamilcar would never forget. So when Hannibal was just a boy, he made him make a blood oath to avenge Carthage's loss and defeat Rome. After the First Punic War, with its naval power all but eradicated, Carthage expanded into the Iberian Peninsula. In Spain, the Carthaginians discovered two things that would alter their fortune. First, in its conquest of the peninsula, they realized that the Spanish were fierce fighters and would make valuable mercenaries. Second, Spain had rich silver and gold mines. Instead of rebuilding the navy, Carthage used the newfound wealth to build a formidable infantry. In 219 BCE, Hannibal occupied the Roman city of Saguntum. Although Carthage had subjugated most of the Iberian Peninsula, Saguntum was located in Roman-held territory, within the corner of the peninsula. Rome demanded that Hannibal leave the city immediately, or face the wrath of Rome's military might. At this pivotal moment, Hannibal had to decide risking another Punic War, or continuing peace as Carthage recovered from the First Punic War. In its warning to Hannibal, Rome offered him either the olive branch of peace, or the sword. Hannibal chose the sword. With Rome controlling the Mediterranean, Hannibal launched one of the most audacious and daring military campaigns in human history. In 218, Hannibal left Spain with an army of 100,000 soldiers, elephants, and officers. Hannibal would march his army across Gaul and through the Alps, which is a feat not duplicated until Napoleon crossed the Alps in 1800 to flank the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo. By today's standards, Hannibal crossing the Alps through hostile territory, while braving the heights and severe cold, remains a feat to marvel at. A large fraction of his army perished in this journey along with several of his elephants, whom he had planned to use to impress tribes and cities along the way, so that they would join his campaign. During the crossing, Hannibal lost one of his eyes, making him appear that much more fierce. The Romans were taken back by such a bold feat, but they sent an army to meet him at both the battles of Trebia River and Trasimene. In both battles, Hannibal had set well-disguised traps that the Romans fell for. The result was two crushing defeats at both battles. At this point, Hannibal, at age 27, had orchestrated two masterful victories against the superpower of the age. Despite these victories, none would be as infamous or famous as the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE. Commanding the Roman troops would be the two co-consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. Commanding the Carthaginian forces would be Hannibal Barca and his brother, Mago Barca. Rome's army was made up of 80,000 legionnaires, many of whom had not seen battle. Accompanying them were 6,000 Roman cavalry. The battle took place east of the river Aufidus in a valley, which is extremely significant, because it forced the legions into a tighter, packed and deeper formation. This would serve Hannibal, who was outnumbered 2-1. The Carthaginian force was a mix of soldiers from all over Europe and Africa, many of whom did not speak the same language. The fact that Hannibal was able to command such a diverse group of soldiers is a testament to his leadership. His army was composed of Spanish, African, and Gallic infantry. Accompanying them were the finest cavalry in antiquity. The Gallic and Spanish horsemen were heavier cavalry and could break most opposing cavalry. With them were the famous Numidian light cavalry, who were known for their elite skirmishing and speed on the battlefield. Hannibal deployed his troops in an inverted arc formation. Hannibal's plan was to allow the Romans to push his center back, giving them a false sense of victory during the battle. As Hannibal's center was continuously pushed back, he planned for the Romans to commit more and more troops to the center in hopes of breaking Hannibal's line. Hannibal placed his best infantry, including himself, in the center. As the center gave way, Hannibal planned for the African infantry on the wings to envelop each Roman flank, as they committed more and more troops to the center. Moreover, Hannibal's victory would also depend on his superior Gallic, Spanish, and Numidian cavalry defeating the opposing Roman cavalry. After beating the Roman cavalry, Hannibal's cavalry would turn and crash into the Roman rearguard. The battle started with a cavalry skirmish that worked its way past the Aufidus River. The Roman legionaries approached en masse and crashed into the Carthaginian infantry. As Hannibal predicted, his center began to give way, and the Romans committed more and more troops to the center. While his elite infantry held the line, Hannibal's superior cavalry engaged in fierce fighting against the Roman cavalry. Despite a valiant effort, the Roman cavalry broke and fled the battlefield. Under overwhelming pressure, especially in the center, Hannibal's troops continued to hold the line as more and more troops were committed to the center. As more troops were sent to the center, the more packed the legionaries became, which denied them of one of their biggest strengths, maneuverability. This neutralized many of the legionaries' ability to effectively fight. On schedule, the African infantry on his flanks began to implement a double envelopment and encircle each Roman flank. Soon after, the German, Spanish, Gallic, and Numidian cavalry slammed against the rear of the Roman army. Hannibal encircled the entire Roman army. The next several hours saw ferocious fighting, with over 60,000 Roman troops dying in one day. The carnage on the battlefield cannot be understated. At the Battle of the Somme in World War I, the British suffered similar losses at the hands of machine guns. The Battle of the Somme is still considered the worst defeat in their history. More than 2,000 years earlier, with swords and spears, Hannibal had inflicted a similar defeat on the Romans. Surrounded, as many of the Roman soldiers attempted to escape. Roughly 14,000 were able to flee, including Varro and Paulus. Against all odds, Hannibal had masterminded one of the most decisive military victories in history. Notably, his tactic of using an inverted arc with the following double envelopment was used by great generals for the next 2+ millennia. Today, Hannibal's strategy at Cannae is still taught in the military. Aftermath. In the wake of his most decisive victory, many of Hannibal's generals urged him to march on Rome. Hannibal, fearing that his numbers were too few to lay siege to Rome, decided not to. According to the historian Livy, Maharbal, leader of the Numidians, famously said to Hannibal, "You know how to win battles, but you do not know how to take advantage of them." Hannibal would spend the next 15 years fighting in the Second Punic War, winning almost every battle he fought. However, in 201 BC, Rome invaded Carthage itself and Hannibal was recalled to lead the defense. A 17-year campaign in Italy saw Hannibal achieve victory after victory, but he could not take Rome. Hannibal would eventually face his defeat in 201 BC at the Battle of Zama against Scipio, whom history would later dub Scipio Africanus. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please like, share, or subscribe, as it would be a great help and keep you notified of new content. Salutations. Few generals can be said to rival Alexander the Great, Hannibal, or Napoleon in the pantheon of military greatness. However, one such general is Gaius Julius Caesar. In this video, we will be covering the Battle of Pharsalus, which saw two juggernauts battle for military supremacy. At stake was the fate of the Roman Republic. In this battle, Caesar would forever etch his name in human history. Julius Caesar had amassed vast wealth, and the loyalty of veteran legions. Most noteworthy was that he was beginning to catch the ire of certain Roman politicians. When Caesar was threatened with imprisonment, he marched on Rome itself. At this time, it was illegal for any Roman army to cross the Rubicon River. Upon crossing, Caesar remarked, "The die is cast," to represent the significance and seriousness of his act. Julius Caesar's abrupt march on Rome forced Pompeian-led Republican forces to retreat across the Adriatic Sea to Greece, where Pompey could count on strong support and muster more legions. To ensure Caesar's forces could not pursue, Pompey gave Biblius control of the Republican fleet which dominated the Adriatic Sea. In contrast, Caesar's fleet could not compete with the Republicans' numbers or quality of ships in the Adriatic. This allowed Pompey to flee to Greece with all of his supporters, including Cato the Younger, Brutus, Cassius, and Labienus. In Greece, Pompey was able to muster many more legions with strong support across Greece. Bibulus had strong command over the Adriatic Sea, which made it almost impossible to cross undetected. Nonetheless, Caesar crossed at night, able to get roughly half of his force on a daring night crossing. His presence in Greece was enough to put the Pompeians on alert, but not enough to fully cause a threat. This was due to Pompey's influence on the eastern Roman provinces, especially Greece. There he had a constant, strong supply line, resources, and majority support.
Before Caesar's crossing, he left Mark Antony in charge of the other half of the army with control over most of the Caesar's fleet. Caesar was in a precarious position without the rest of his legions under the control of Antony. With Bibulus controlling the Adriatic, Caesar was effectively cut off from his base of strength in Italy. In Greece, Caesar had fewer legions, no support, and no supply line. As time passed in 49 BCE, Caesar's situation became increasingly more grim. Pompey knew that Caesar was cut off with no resources except for those of conquered cities and his foraging parties. All Pompey had to do was wait for Caesar to run out of resources and deny Caesar the decisive battle he had needed in order to survive. The fate of the Roman civil war hung in the balance. Caesar continued to pressure Antony to make a crossing and meet up with Caesar's forces with more legionnaires and much-needed supplies. Eventually, Antony was able to cross the Adriatic, but not with all of the legionnaires. Regardless, he was able to fight his way and unite with Caesar's forces. Together, they formed a formidable threat to the Republican army because Caesar's forces were grizzled veterans, including the famed 10th Legion. Despite Caesar's threat, Caesar was still at a disadvantage without all of his legionnaires, and the Republican fleet still controlling the Adriatic Sea. In 48 BCE, Caesar and Pompey finally met near the town of Pharsalus. Both stood opposite of each other, with Pompey occupying more favorable, higher ground. Pompey could still wait for Caesar to run out of resources, but Pompey also had to listen to his council. Pompey represented the Republic, not Pompey, although many of the legionnaires had allegiance to Pompey and respected his military career. Pompey's council urged him to fight Caesar because of their numerical advantage, especially in cavalry. Pompey's cavalry outnumbered Caesar's cavalry 7,300 to roughly 1,000 to 2,000. Not only did it outnumber Caesar's cavalry, but it was led by Labienus. Pompey had 1. The high ground, 2. More resources with a stable supply line, and 3. A bigger army with more cavalry. There is no question that Pompey had the advantage going into Pharsalus, but Pompey did not want to risk the entire civil war in one battle when they had so many advantages by not fighting. Pompey knew that giving battle to Caesar would be falling into his trap. As each day passed, Caesar's situation became more precarious. Pompey did not want to give Caesar's veteran legions the chance to snatch victory from a desperate situation like it had on so many prior occasions. However, the other Republican voices in Pompey's camp had their way and forced Pompey into giving Caesar the fight he needed by claiming that their strengths gave them reason to win and bring a swift end to the war. Both armies assembled on the field of Pharsalus directly next to the Enipeus River, with Pompey occupying the north and Caesar on the south. Pompey positioned his left flank next to the river for cover from encirclement. He had newly recruited legionnaires form his center with the veteran 1st Legion defending his right flank. Labienus commanded. The numeral advantage of Pompey's cavalry was to serve as his strongest weapon. With it, he sought to destroy Caesar's smaller cavalry and encircle Caesar's army. Behind Labienus spread his massive mounted force. The 2,700 long-haired German and Gallic cavalrymen Labienus had brought to Pompey from Caesar's army formed the core. 500 Italian troopers had been brought up from Greece by sea by Gnaeus Pompey. King Diotarus of Galatia had brought Pompey 600 cavalry. The remaining cavalrymen had been supplied by various rulers from throughout the east. The main responsibility for the success lay with Labienus' own men. Caesar placed his army opposite Pompey's army. On Caesar's extreme right, he placed the veteran 10th, 11th, and 12th legions. In the center, he placed the 25th, 26th, and 29th legions under the command of General Domitius. Finally, on his left flank, Caesar placed his remaining legions under the control of Mark Antony. Caesar's generals warned him that Pompey would aim to use the numerically superior cavalry to destroy his right flank. To counter Pompey's cavalry massing on his right, Caesar developed his own 1,000-man cavalry composed of Germans and Gauls supported by auxiliaries. In addition, Caesar created a 4th line that would confront the mass of cavalry after his smaller cavalry were overrun. Caesar ordered, have one cohort taken from each of the legions, and form them into a 4th line, behind the 10th legion, where they are to await the order to charge the enemy's cavalry. The amount of legionnaires in the 4th line is debatable, but it is estimated the number is around 2,000. These troops were ordered to lay down out of sight and spring up with their javelins to surprise Pompey's numerically superior cavalry. Caesar hoped this unseen 4th line would be able to shatter Pompey's cavalry with their javelins. According to Dando Collins, never before had so many Roman troops faced each other on a single battlefield. Never before had 2 of Rome's greatest generals fought it out like this. Pompey, conqueror of the East, 57, a former young achiever who had made history in his 20s, a multimillionaire, an excellent military organizer, a master strategist, coming off a victory with the larger army. And Caesar, conqueror of the West, who had celebrated his 52nd birthday only 3 weeks before in the month that would eventually bear his name, who had been nearly 40 before he made his first military mark, an original tactician and engineering genius with a mastery of detail, a commander with dash, the common touch, luck, and the smaller but more experienced army. Plutarch lamented on how 70,000 Romans, a force big enough to conquer Parthia or march to India unrivaled, had instead decided on fighting their own brothers. Pompey wanted to achieve a quick end to the battle and avoid possible mishaps from some of his newly recruited legionnaires. Because of this, he deployed his cavalry first. Within seconds, 7,000 horses and riders were charging across the wheat field. In response, Caesar's German and Gallic cavalry lurched forward to meet the Pompeian charge, with their auxiliary light infantry. The Battle of Pharsalus had begun. Infantry on both sides remained where they were unwatched in awe as Pompey's massive cavalry force clashed with Caesar's. As expected, the Pompeian cavalry defeated the much smaller Caesarian cavalry force. Labienus and his horses pushed on, but they were in for an unfortunate and bloody surprise. Upon the sound of trumpets, Caesar's 4th line, surprised, the Germans and Gauls at close quarters, pumping their javelins as instructed, taking out eyes, causing horrific facial injuries and fatalities with every strike. The congested cavalry had come to a dead stop. The panic that was created quickly spread to the Allied cavalrymen behind them. Seeing the carnage, the Allied riders disengaged from Caesar's cavalry, turned, and galloped from the battlefield, heading in terror for the hills. As Pompey's cavalry was chased from the field, his left flank was completely exposed. The 4th line and Caesar's cavalry turned and crashed into his flank. The only thing stopping Caesar's forces from outflanking Pompey's army were a few thousand archers and slingers. Caesar's forces powered through the archers, who stood their ground bravely, while the slingers ran away. Caesar then sounded for the general charge of his legionnaires. Pompey decided to keep his legions in static formation instead of running to meet the opposing line, as was the standard of the time. Pompey sought to make Caesar's legions run twice the distance while minimizing any disorganization that might be caused by giving his own general order to charge. There was a stalemate on the front line. However, Caesar's right flank began to swing onto the flank and rear of Pompey's First Legion. Pompey knew that if his veteran First Legion could not hold, then none of his legions could. He tried desperately to preserve his flank, but the First Legion broke under the overwhelming pressure. Once Caesar gained the initiative on the right flank, the fight became a rout. Caesar's legions were able to roll up Pompey's legions like a carpet, each legion breaking and retreating one at a time. Pompey retreated to his camp prematurely while contemplating the gravity of the situation. He had all the advantages going into battle, and he knew it, but Caesar had forced the Republicans' hand. Against all odds, Caesar was able to defeat Pompey in the decisive battle he had been seeking for so long. Aftermath. Against the odds, Caesar had defeated the main Republican army. However, Republican senators fled to North Africa and Spain in order to continue the resistance and raise another army to confront Caesar. Unfortunately for Pompey, Pharsalus was his last great battle. Instead of going with his allies in the Senate, he traveled to Egypt instead. He hoped to raise funds and support in Egypt. However, King Ptolemy XIII of Egypt, seeking to gain favor with Caesar's movement, beheaded Pompey, thus ending the great career of one of Rome's greatest generals. Pharsalus remains one of the most important battles in history. It altered the course of Rome and the world forever. Although Caesar had won this massive clash of titans, he would still need to defeat Cato, Labienus, and other Republican resistance. Nonetheless, Pharsalus represented the turning of the tide in the Roman Civil War.
Few battles can truly be considered as altering the course of world history. However, one such battle is the Battle of Tours in 732 AD. In this video, we will explore the background and lead up to the battle itself, and the aftermath. Prelude. In the 4th century, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine decided that Christianity would be the religion of the remaining Roman Empire. Many European kingdoms followed suit, such as the Goths and Visigoths in Italy, Spain, and Gaul. While Christianity was still in its infancy, in the 7th century, the Prophet Muhammad and his followers engaged in a military expansion so rapid and successful that it has arguably not been duplicated. During his lifetime, Muhammad expanded the Islamic religion throughout the Middle East, parts of Anatolia, and North Africa. By the time of his death in 632, Muhammad had left his successors a bridgehead for a series of further conquests, especially now that Islam had considerably grown. After his death, the Islamic caliphates launched military conquests that spread the word of Islam from Afghanistan all the way to Spain. By 700 AD, the Islamic caliphates had subjugated or made vassals the entire Middle East, Arabian Peninsula, Northern Africa, and the Iberian Peninsula. In 711 AD, a strong Muslim force, led by Tariq, invaded Visigoth-controlled Spain from North Africa. The speed and audacity of the invasion caught the Visigoths by surprise. Near Gibraltar, the Muslim forces defeated the Visigoths, and the Visigoth king Witiza fled Spain. Europe was stunned at the ease and speed with which Visigoth Spain was subjugated. From 711 to 731, the Muslim expansion appeared that it would not stop at the Iberian Peninsula, but they aimed to invade the heart of Europe. These 2 decades saw several raids and armies invade Aquitaine and Burgundy, 2 vital areas in southern France. When the Gauls and Goths saw that the incursions were going deeper and deeper, they decided to meet the Islamic forces near the towns of Tours and Poitiers in 732 AD. The Battle of Tours or Poitiers in 732 was between the Frankish and Gothic forces led by Charles Martel, whom history would later dub the Hammer. Charles is widely revered throughout Europe and France. He was regarded as a staunch defender of Christianity. The Islamic forces from the Umayyad Caliphate was led by Abd ul-Rahman al-Ghafiqi. Al-Ghafiqi rose to power through military conquest and became the governor of Islam-controlled Spain, which was known as Al-Andalus. In October 732, Charles finally met Al-Ghafiqi outside the towns of Tours and Poitiers in France. Historians have debated the number of each army, but it is widely agreed that numbers were similar, with the Frankish forces being slightly outnumbered. Al-Ghafiqi also had more cavalry than the Franks, which gave him more maneuverability. Conversely, the Franks had heavier infantry than the Muslims. The Frankish forces likely numbered 20 to 30,000 troops, while the Islamic forces numbered 30 to 35,000. Seeing this disadvantage, Charles hid part of his contingent in a nearby forest. The Franks planned to engage the entire Islamic force, and at the right time, the hidden contingent of massed heavy infantry would smash against Al-Ghafiqi's flank. Staking the future of Central Europe in one battle was extremely risky, considering the last century had seen the Islamic forces prevail against troops of all kinds in all parts of the world. At a time where Europe could not field armies like those of Rome in its golden age, the Franks amassed a huge force for the time period. At stake was the future of Christian Europe. Both armies' deployment was not complex. Each army advanced to face each other, with the mounted Islamic forces approaching more rapidly. Upon collision, the Islamic forces were surprised to hit a bulwark of heavily armed infantry that held the line upon a crushing attack. The Christians fought with ferocity because they knew that losing the battle would mean losing all of France and Christian Europe. As each side fought ferociously, Charles and the Franks managed to hold on. If the attack on the flank was going to work, Charles needed to hold the line, while Al-Ghafiqi committed the majority of his troops. Charles and the Franks did their duty, and as planned, the heavy Frankish infantry crashed into Al-Ghafiqi's flank. This not only broke the right flank of Ghafiqi's army, but it rallied the rest of the Frankish troops. At this moment, the Franks launched a crushing counterattack that broke the Islamic force. In this push, Al-Ghafiqi was killed. Upon news of Ghafiqi's death, the Islamic forces engaged in a widespread retreat. Outnumbered, with the fate of Christian Europe in the balance, Charles Martel delivered a victory so decisive that marked the end of any incursion of Muslim armies into Central Europe. This victory established the Carolingian dynasty, which would include the first Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne. I have included notable quotes from historians that depict the history-altering nature of the Battle of Tours in 732 AD. One historian said, as later chroniclers increasingly came to praise Charles Martel as the champion of Christianity, pre-20th century historians began to characterize this battle as being the decisive turning point in the struggle against Islam. Another historian asserted that most of the 18th and 19th century historians, like Gibbon, saw Poitiers, Tours, as a landmark battle that marked the high tide of the Muslim advance into Europe. And Leopold von Ranke stated that Poitiers was the turning point of one of the most important epochs in the history of the world. Aftermath. The Battle of Tours is widely seen as the battle that saved Christian Europe while it was still in its infancy. Francia would emerge as the de facto defender of Christendom, with Charlemagne, a descendant of Charles Martel, becoming the Holy Roman Emperor. For the Umayyad Muslims, their conquest into Central Europe had been halted, but they remained an important influence in the Iberian Peninsula for centuries. In Spain, Islamic culture flourished. Notably, there is still heavy Islamic influence in the form of language and architecture in cities such as Córdoba, Zaragoza, and Toledo. The influence on the Spanish language cannot be understated. For example, the use of ul in the Islamic language was adopted by the Spanish. Another saying in Spanish is ojalá, which is used in Spanish and Latin American countries to express hopefully. Broken down, the phrase means "Oh Allah." The impact of the Battle of Tours cannot be understated. First, it halted Muslim expansion into European Christendom. Second, Western Europe finally had a Christian bulwark like that of the Byzantine Empire. Third, the defeat led the Muslims to settle in the Iberian Peninsula, where it flourished and contributed to Spanish and Portuguese culture that can still be seen and felt today. Thank you so much. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, as it would be a great help and notify you of new content.
Arguably one of the most famous military expeditions in history is that of Subutai and Jabi. Their expedition saw conquest of the entire Caucasus region, including kingdoms in Azerbaijan, Georgia, and even the Cuman Kipchaks. In this video, I will cover one of their most decisive victories at the Battle of Kalka River, where the Mongols, under Jabi and Subutai, defeated a larger coalition of Rus principalities and Cuman Kipchaks. In 1206, Genghis Khan and his Mongol horde embarked on one of the most audacious military campaigns that would see them establish the largest contiguous land empire in history. By 1227, Mongol hegemony would stretch from the Mongolian steppe to the front door of Eastern European kingdoms such as the Kievan Rus. For purposes of this video, we will cover Jabi and Subutai's expeditionary raid around the Caucasus region. Initially, they were ordered to engage in an expedition to the kingdoms in Georgia and Azerbaijan. However, after sacking Bukhara, Urgench, and Cumans, they proceeded further inward until they reached the Rus principalities. Several Cumans had escaped to the Rus principalities, so Jabi and Subutai demanded that the Rus hand over the Kupchaks that had escaped. In an act of defiance, the Rus principalities refused to hand over the Cumans and formed an army to meet the Mongols. The Rus territory was broken into several principalities, each led by its own prince. Under Mstislav III of Kiev, Yuri II of Vladimir, and Mstislav of Galicia, the Rus princes united to form an army of 30,000. Their force was largely composed of heavy cavalry, knights, men-at-arms, and Cuman horse archers. Their army had over roughly 100 regional princes and nobles. In contrast, Jabi and Subutai had roughly 20,000 mounted units, mostly light cavalry and horse archers with a mix of heavy cavalry. It is important to note that Mongol heavy cavalry was different from European heavy cavalry, because the horse breeds in the Mongolian steppe were smaller. Each force met each other near the Dnieper River in Kievan Rus territory. The initial engagement saw Rus overpower the light cavalry, but midway through the battle, the Mongols employed their most famous and deadly tactic, the feigned retreat. A feigned retreat was withdrawing from the battlefield as to appear defeated, so the opposing force would give chase thinking that they had won the battle. In chasing the retreating force, gaps would form between the chasing troops, which would allow for an effective and vicious counterattack. For 9 days, the Mongols feigned a retreat, and the three major armies continued to give chase. However, they were in for a brutal surprise. After the Mongols had crossed the Kalka River, they turned and crashed into the dispersed and separated armies. The force of the counterattack was so powerful that it completely scattered and obliterated the Cumans. Upon sight of the Cumans' defeat, the other armies fled as fast as possible. The Mongols, however, gave chase and caught up to the fleeing armies. Once the Rus were encircled, the Mongols allowed for a gap, so the enemy could flee, but this was a trick. It allowed the Mongols to funnel the remaining troops to make it easier to pick them off. To this day, Kalka River remains one of Russia's worst defeats. Over 81 princes and nobles were captured. In an act of gross savagery, the Mongols feasted on a wooden plank that laid on top of the captured Rus nobility. What makes the Battle of Kalka River such a monumental battle is that the Mongols did a 9-day feigned retreat against a larger force thousands of miles from their base of strength, and their tactics worked. It is likely the longest feigned retreat by an entire army in military history. Aftermath and significance. The battle at Kalka River set up 100+ years of Mongol control over the Rus principalities. One principality decided to submit willingly, Novgorod. Novgorod would go on to be modern-day Moscow. For this victory, and the entire expedition, JB and Subutai would go down as two of the greatest generals in military history. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like, share, or subscribe, as it would be a great help and keep you notified of new content.
A battle that altered the course of world history is the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260 AD. In this battle, the Mongols faced off against the Mamluks who controlled Egypt, the Levant and Palestine. In this video, I will cover the Battle of Ain Jalut, the events that led to it, and the significance and aftermath. After the Mongols sacked and destroyed Baghdad, the last Islamic caliphate in existence was the Mamluk Sultanate. As part of the Mongols' strategy of expanding westward, they sought to break through into North Africa via the Levantine coast along Palestine, the Sinai, and eventually through Egypt. However, in order to do so, they would need to subjugate the Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled this territory. In 1259, Syria was invaded and conquered by a Christian-Turkish coalition led by Kitbuga. At this moment, it appeared that the Mamluk Sultanate was weak, so the Mongols sent envoys to demand their surrender as vassals. The Mamluks executed the envoys and amassed an army to meet the Mongols at Ain Jalut on September 3, 1260. Ain Jalut is located just north of Jerusalem. Ain Jalut means Goliath's spring because it was the place where King David of Israel killed the Philistine warrior Goliath, as it was described in the book of Samuel. Both armies were equal in size. The Mongol army was comprised of Syrians, Christian Georgians, Armenians. They were led by Kitbuga. The Mamluks were led by Baybars. The Mamluks were slave soldiers that had formed their own state. The battle started with several skirmishes, and Baybars, in an act of irony, implemented the feigned retreat, which was the Mongols' most famous tactic. Baybars masterfully orchestrated a successful feigned retreat to a nearby wooded region where the majority of the army was stationed. The Mamluks had hidden contingents in the woods. When the Mongols were lured into the trap, the hidden forces fell on the Mongols. Instead of fleeing from the battlefield, Kitbuga attempted his own feigned retreats, but the Mamluks did not fall for the maneuvers. In close hand-to-hand fighting, the Mamluks used a hand cannon called the midfa. The fighting was intense and savage. Contemporary accounts state that the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz threw down his helmet and delivered an inspiring speech, which urged that his men fight in the name of Islam. At this pivotal moment, the Mamluks broke the stalemate and surrounded the Mongol forces. The Mongol general, Kitbuga, was killed or captured. The Mamluks' decisive victory over the invading Mongols ensured the survival of the last Islamic caliphate in the world. The Battle of Ain Jalut is widely seen as the battle that saved Islam. It is the finest hour of the Mamluk Sultanate. It is monumental because, 1. It halted the Mongols' westward expansion and contained them to the Iran and Mesopotamia region, and 2. It ensured the Mamluks' long-lasting survival until almost 6 centuries later in the Napoleonic Wars, where it would face the French Emperor himself. In a twist of cruel irony, Baybars was killed on the trip back to Cairo because he allegedly had formed a conspiracy against the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like, comment, or share, as it would be a great help and keep you notified of new content.
A monumental point in history that is often overlooked is the 80 Years' War, which is composed of the Dutch War of Independence and the 30 Years' War. In this video, I will summarize the major events in the Dutch War of Independence from 1568 to 1609. This conflict would be heavily influenced and characterized by its religious nature. Against the odds, the Dutch would struggle for decades to ultimately achieve its independence. Few remember that Spain, under King Philip II, controlled parts of France, Belgium and Netherlands in the 16th century. Their claim was based mostly on their military strength. From 1568 to 1648, Europe would see the Dutch War of Independence and European powers fight over the right to freely practice their religion. The conflict would see Spain, who was pro-Catholic, seek to impose Catholic rule over Protestant and Calvinist territories. Spain, with its large influxes of gold and silver from the Americas, was able to wage wars all across Europe during the 80 Years' War. At this time, Spain was the superpower of the age. The first 40 years was composed of the Dutch War of Independence from 1568 to 1609. The war possessed heavy religious influence for the aforementioned reasons and would see the Calvinist and Protestant Dutch northern provinces struggle against the pro-Spanish and Catholic southern provinces. Despite facing the superpower of the time, the Dutch would launch continuous rebellions, behind figures like William of Orange, in an effort to secure their independence. Eventually, the United Provinces of the Netherlands, or Dutch Republic, was formed after decades of struggle. I have included a timeline to make the events easier to follow. I will take a moment, so you can review. From 1568 to 1572, William of Orange launched two unsuccessful raids with the help of the Guizen, who were Dutch, Calvinist mercenaries with land and sea forces. The Guizen's intervention, partly because of their Calvinist faith, were a large contributing factor in sparking the revolt against the pro-Catholic Spanish rule. In 1573, with the help of the Guizen, the provinces of Holland were secured against Spanish rule and converted to Calvinism. By 1576, all of the other provinces joined the revolt. In 1579, the northern provinces formed Union of Utrecht in opposition to Spain. The same year, the Spanish began to exercise their military strength and political influence, which in part led to the weakening of the Dutch Union when the Roman Catholic Walloons left the Union. These provinces left the Dutch Union and entered the pro-Spanish, pro-Catholic Union of 1579, which included many of the southern provinces. 1580 to 1604 would see the Spanish exact heavy defeats on the Dutch. In 1584, the Spanish had William of Orange assassinated. This was a significant blow to the Dutch resistance, as William had been a staunch advocate for independence and formidable leader. From 1584 to 1585, the Spanish laid siege to and subjugated Bruges, Ypres, and Ghent and sacked the cities of Brussels and Antwerp. Despite the heavy string of losses, the northern Dutch provinces still had one advantage, which was the ability to flood part of the provinces by opening the dikes, and the assistance of the Calvinist Guizen mercenaries. These forces had superiority over the Spanish at sea, so they could resupply and regarrison strongholds when possible. In 1588, under the Duke of Parma, the Spanish were able to subjugate all of the southern provinces and seemed poised to root out the Dutch dream of independence. However, during this time, Spain had also involved itself in conflicts against the French and English. The gold and silver from the Americas allowed Spain to field armies that could counter each nation, but these conflicts gave time to the Dutch northern provinces to gather their strength and launch counter-offensives. The major battle in the Dutch War of Independence was the Battle of Ostend from July 1601 to September 1604, where the Spanish laid siege to the last Protestant stronghold in Flanders. The siege lasted 3 years and is often referred to as the New Troy for its staggering length. In 1601, the leaders of the Spanish Netherlands arrived with 20,000 troops, commanded by Albert of Austria. In contrast, the garrison at Ostend numbered 3,500 and were severely outnumbered. The garrison forces were under the command of Francis Vere, an Englishman. By the winter of 1601, the defenders in Ostend had been significantly weakened by starvation, fatigue, and disease. In order to stall an imminent Spanish attack, Vere parleyed with the Spanish, which allowed much-needed resources and soldiers to be ferried into the garrison by its allies and Guzan. This allowed the garrison at Ostend to repel Spanish attacks, and by 1602, the defenders now numbered 7,000. The defenders at Ostend were able to repel attack after attack, and their staunch resolve weakened Spanish morale. However, in 1602, the Spanish were reinforced by 9,000 Italian troops under Ambrogio Spinolo. The Italians were able to use sappers and mines to eventually bring down the garrison. In 1604, the defenders finally surrendered to the Spanish, but after a significant price. The Siege of Ostend is often seen as the largest and bloodiest conflict in the Dutch War of Independence. Its staggering 3-year siege has not been replicated in military history. Despite the loss of Ostend, the Spanish were war-weary and faced 3 hostile enemies in England, France, and Dutch provinces. In 1609, the 12-year truce was signed, which recognized Dutch independence. After 40 bloody years of conflict, the Dutch, against the superpower of the time and overwhelming odds, had achieved its independence. Unfortunately, this peace would be short-lived as the religious nature of the conflict bled into the 30 Years' War, which saw much of Europe engulfed in a colossal struggle over religious dominance. Aftermath and significance. The Dutch War of Independence is noteworthy because it was the spark that led to the religious wars that would see over 30 million Europeans displaced from 1568 to 1648. These 80 years would go on to shape Europe and the world forever. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like, share, or subscribe, as it would be a great help and notify you of new content.
How's everybody doing today? So I'm going to be discussing the Battle of the Alamo in 1836. There are few battles in American history that can galvanize an entire population, and the Battle of the Alamo is one of those battles. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach on this video and narrate it myself. So I have outlined my PowerPoint in the following manner. So first, I'm going to discuss some background, the creation of the Alamo, how it was created. Second, I'm going to discuss a prelude to the battle. Third, I'm going to discuss the battle itself. And fourth, I'm going to discuss the aftermath. And then I'm just going to give a brief conclusion. So background. After years of petitioning Spain, the Viceroy of New Spain, Father Antonio de San Buenaventura, and Baltasar de Zuniga were granted permission to construct a mission that was near the San Antonio River at the time. And it would go on to be known as the Mission San Antonio de Valero. And that was built and christened on May 1st, 1718. However, by the end of the 18th century, the mission was abandoned. It was initially built so that it could serve as a foothold for Spain and possibly convert indigenous populations to Catholicism. Over time, as it became abandoned, Spanish troops would intermittently occupy the Alamo. And initially, it was called the Misión San Antonio de Valero, But after a short amount of time after it was abandoned, it became known as the Alamo, meaning cottonwood. And it was named the Alamo because it had cottonwood trees at the location. So, prelude to the battle. From 1835 to 1836, there was the beginning of the Texas War of Independence. And so, in December 1835, a small group of volunteer militia drove out Mexican troops that were located at the Alamo. The position was difficult to defend, and the famous Sam Houston even advised that they abandon the position because of how difficult it was to defend. However, these were staunch defenders, and they did not want to give up the position. And some notable figures that were leading the volunteer militia at the Alamo were James Bowie, Davy Crockett, and William Travis. And I included a little picture here to show the revolt that occurred, the revolution that occurred in Texas from 1835 to 1836. Now, the battle itself started on February 23rd, 1836, when Santa Anna showed up with about 1,600 to 6,000 troops, vastly outnumbering the defenders, who only numbered about roughly 185. But despite being outnumbered by so much, they put up a staunch defense for about 13 days. However, on the dawn of March 6th, 1836, the Mexican soldiers launched an all-out attack on every part of the Alamo. Although the defenders were able to repel 2 initial attacks, the third one they could not, and eventually the Mexican troops were able to scale the southern wall and break through and overwhelm the defenders. The defenders retreated back to the chapel for a last stand, which saw some savage hand-to-hand fighting. Santa Anna ordered that no prisoners be taken, except about 10 to 15 women and children were spared. And so for 13 days, it was just brutal fighting. And here's a painting to depict how savage the fighting was. And on this next slide, I included a picture of the Alamo so that you get a better understanding. The part I outlined in red is the part that still stands today, and you can go visit it in San Antonio. You see here where Davy Crockett defended, and William Travis was killed on the north wall. And so this is a great picture. If you want to look at it more in depth, you can pause it. I'm going to stay on it just a little bit longer. But yeah, you see the chapel as well, where they fell back for the last stand. Aftermath. So the sacrifice by the defenders at the Alamo very much inspired the leader of the Texan army, who was Sam Houston at the time. So on April 21st, 1836, Sam Houston arrived with about 900 troops, and he soundly defeated Santa Anna at the Battle of San Jacinto. Their war cry was "Remember the Alamo." And in the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848, that would be the motto and the predominant war cry throughout that war. And in 1845, the United States annexed Texas to become a state. Now, it's also notable to mention that there were also some creative resistance to the war in Mexico, notably Henry David Thoreau, who I did a video on about a couple months ago. But who spoke out against the war. But for the Texans, they saw this as a war of independence and a war to avenge those that were slain at the Alamo. And I included here a picture of the Battle of San Jacinto, so you can look at that. Conclusion. So the resistance, as I mentioned, it served to galvanize an entire nation, and it's a historic landmark today. And if you mention the Alamo to anybody, they'll most likely, uh, for lack of a better term, remember the Alamo and what happened there and the sacrifice. Notably, also that Davy Crockett, a famous frontiersman, died there. Um, so that's my presentation on the Alamo. That was a video request by someone recently, and I wanted to get it out as quick as possible. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. That would do a lot to help the channel and keep you notified of new content. One of the worst and most embarrassing defeats for the United States in its history was the Battle of the Little Bighorn in June 25th, 1876, which is also known as Custer's Last Stand. The battle took place on the Little Bighorn River in the Montana Territory. In this video, I will explore the battle, the events leading up to the battle, and the significance of the battle. The battle was between U.S. federal troops and the Northern Plains Indians, composed of the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and some of the Arapaho and Comanche. The federal troops were led by George A. Custer, while the Native Americans were led by the famous Sitting Bull. The Battle of Little Bighorn is remembered for three main reasons. First, it was Custer's last stand, where he and 210 soldiers all fought to the death. Second, it marks the pinnacle of the Native American resistance against the United States. And third, it represents Custer's major blunder in attacking the fortified camp and issuing bad military orders. The Battle of Little Bighorn is characteristic of the United States' confusing, brutal, and dysfunctional policy towards the Native Americans. In 1868, the Native Americans and the United States entered into the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, which allowed the Sioux and Arapaho Indians exclusive possession of the Dakota Territory west of the Missouri River. However, U.S. settlements put at risk this tentative peace by settling in this area in search of gold. The Lakota Native Americans were unwilling to sell and be forced into another disadvantageous treaty. In an act of bad faith, the United States broke off their treaty of 1868 and issued an order that all Indians be forced into designated reservations as to accommodate the settlers. Any refusing Native Americans would be deemed hostile. Prelude to the battle. The stage had been set for yet another hostile confrontation between the United States and Native Americans. The Native Americans, including bands of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne, formed a resistance and united under the charismatic leadership of Sitting Bull, who called for a rebellion against U.S. expansion. The rebelling Native Americans met at the rendezvous point at Little Bighorn River in southern Montana. They planned to also celebrate the annual Sundance ceremony. In spring 1876, Lieutenant General Philip Sheridan ordered that 3 army columns converge on Lakota country in order to subjugate the rebels, led by Alfred H. Terry and Colonel John Gibbon. Alfred Terry's column was composed mostly of the U.S. 7th Cavalry Division under George Custer. Terry wanted Custer to attack the Lakota from the south, forcing them into smaller forces that would push them up the Little Bighorn River. The battle. However, on the morning of June 25, 1876, Custer's scouts discovered Sitting Bull's village. They also saw a band of stray native warriors that they assumed would go back and tell the camp that Custer planned to attack. At this pivotal moment in history, Custer decided to launch an all-out attack. Custer split his battalions into 3 companies under Major Reno, who was to attack the village directly, Captain Frederick Benteen, who was to cut off retreat from the south, and himself, who was to attack the village from the north. By separating his force, Custer made a massive blunder because each group was unable to meet with each other or provide support to each other. As the military engagement unfolded, Custer and the 7th Cavalry fell victim to a series of surprises, most notably the number of Sioux troops they actually encountered. According to their intelligence, there were only 800 warriors. However, the 7th Cavalry were fatally surprised to be facing 2,000 experienced Sioux and Cheyenne warriors. Custer's 210 soldiers were cut off from the rest of the forces and were all killed in a fight that lasted roughly 2 hours. This fight became known as Custer's Last Stand. The only column to survive from the initial 3 was Reno's battalion, which had been reinforced by the remnants of Benteen's contingent. The actual movements and logistics of the battle are shrouded in mystery and have been highly hypothesized. However, one figure that has been celebrated for their courage is Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and the other Indian leaders. Conclusion. Along with Native American legends such as Tecumseh, the last stand of Sitting Bull against Custer's 7th Cavalry went down in history as one of the Native Americans' greatest moments and finest hours. Though it proved to be the pinnacle of Native American resistance, it has been an event that is highly idealized and revered, especially as a symbol of resistance by an oppressed group in the face of overwhelming.
be covering the epic Yom Kippur War in 1973 that saw Arab forces behind Assad and Sadat launch an offensive against Elazar and Israelis on the holy day of Yom Kippur. The Yom Kippur War began on October 6, 1973, when Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a simultaneous attack. After the Six-Day War in 1967, Arab nations had been humiliated and embarrassed, and suffered severe military defeat. In 1970, Anwar el-Sadat was elected president of Egypt. Sadat vowed to regain the areas lost in the Six-Day War and restore Arab pride. There were four main objectives: 1. Retake the Sinai, 2. Retake the Golan Heights, 3. Capture the West Bank, and 4. Secure the Suez Canal shipping lanes. In 1971, Sadat formed an agreement with the Soviet Union, which resulted in the sale of arms. The Soviets would provide essential weapons to Egypt and Syria, which included the latest technology in anti-aircraft missiles and anti-tank SAM missiles. This allowed Egyptian forces to regain strength after their military had been paralyzed in the Six-Day War. In the following years, Sadat and the Syrian leader, Hafiz al-Assad, organized a strategic military offensive to retake the Golan Heights and Sinai. Assad would launch an offensive along the Syrian-Israeli border in order to regain the Golan Heights. Simultaneously, Sadat would launch an offensive to retake Sinai by crossing the Suez Canal and capturing the Bar-Lev line. This line was one of the most formidable defense barriers in the world, and included forts and sand barriers 70 feet high. As a result, the Israelis did not expect the Arab nations to attack. However, on October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a simultaneous ground attack that caught the Israelis off guard. The Egyptian forces achieved an impressive military victory by crossing the Suez Canal and retaking the Bar-Lev line. Syria also achieved early success by retaking the majority of the Golan Heights. With military equipment provided by the Soviets, the Egyptian and Syrian forces were able to neutralize Israel's largest strengths, its tanks and aircrafts. The two Arab nations achieved early success, but Israel was able to mount a counteroffensive after a few days. This was led by Israeli General David Elazar, and it included a bold attack on the Egyptian forces in Sinai. Israeli forces were able to split and isolate Egypt's Third Army and cut off their supply routes. In the Golan Heights, Israeli forces were able to push back the Syrian military. Israel would eventually achieve an astonishing comeback and win the Yom Kippur War, but it came at a cost. Israel's invincibility and military superiority had been diminished, and they were no longer this unbeatable force. For the Arab nations, the Yom Kippur War achieved a renewed sense of morale and confidence, especially because of the early impressive military victories. Egypt was the nation that gained the most from this victory, because of their impressive siege of the Bar-Lev line. This would set the stage for a remarkable peace initiative, and 4 years later, Egyptian leader Anwar al-Sadat would become the first Arab leader to visit Israel.
In this video, I will look at the Camp David Peace Accords, which involved a peace deal between the Israelis and Egyptians. On November 19, 1977, Anwar Sadat became the first Arab leader to visit Israel officially when he met with Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. This was a monumental event that marked a shift in the Arab-Israeli conflict. In 1978, Anwar al-Sadat, Jimmy Carter, and Menachem Begin met in Camp David, Maryland for 12 days of secret peace negotiations. The Israeli-Egyptian negotiations were concluded by the signing of the Camp David Accords at the White House on September 17, 1978. The Camp David Accords had two main frameworks. The first dealt with the future of the Sinai and peace between Israel and Egypt. The second was a framework agreement establishing a format for the conduct of negotiations for the establishment of an autonomy regime in the West Bank and Gaza. The Israel-Egypt agreement clearly defined the future relations between the two countries. As a result of the agreement, there was mutual recognition of each country by the other, the cessation of the state of war that had existed since 1948, and the complete withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from the rest of the Sinai Peninsula, which Israel had captured during the 1967 Six-Day War. The agreement also provided Israel free passage through the Suez Canal. This was extremely unpopular in most of Egypt and the Arab world. By signing the accords, many Arabs believed Sadat had put Egypt's interests ahead of Arab unity, which betrayed Nasser's pan-Arabism and destroyed the vision of a united Arab front against Israel. Sadat's shift towards a strategic relationship with Israel was condemned by most Arab nations and resulted in inflammatory insults and political isolation. Sadat would be recognized for his peace efforts when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Unfortunately, extremist Arab factions believed his recognition of Israel as a state and peace deal at Camp David was a betrayal to the pro-Arab position and assassinated Anwar Sadat. He would go on to become a symbol of peace and martyr in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, share, comment, or subscribe, as it would be a great help and keep you notified of new content. After World War II, the United States and its Western allies had engaged in a period of high tension against the Soviet Union and its communist allies. This period was marked by wars in Korea in the early 1950s and Vietnam in the 60s. In addition, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a determining factor that marked the beginning of Detente. The Cuban Missile Crisis threatened a global holocaust, so the world wanted to avert global nuclear warfare. The 1970s witnessed Detente. The two main reasons for Detente, or relaxation of tension, were, 1. The horrors of Vietnam shocked people, 2. There was a growing fear of a nuclear holocaust, especially with the growth in those countries that had nuclear weapons. Also, both USA and USSR had huge stockpiles of weapons. Each major power had its own reason to pursue Detente. China was fearful of her isolation in the world. She was also fearful of what USA had done in Vietnam. China's stockpile of nuclear weapons was a lot smaller than that of USA. China was also worried by her worsening relations with USSR. The USA realized that there were better ways of containing communism than the ways that she'd done in previous years. She was also aware of the massive cost of weapons production and maintaining a huge armed force. A peaceful relationship with the USSR would be very beneficial to USA, especially after the cost of the Vietnam War. The USSR was spending a huge amount on weapons at the expense of basic household goods. Living standards were poor, and USSR was also aware that her relationship with China was far from good, while USA was trying to improve hers with China. How did the world's major powers attempt to ease world tension? USSR and USA. In 60s and 70s, the Soviet Union and United States engaged in mutual acts of good faith. In 1963, a direct hotline established after Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1963, both agreed to only use underground tests for nuclear explosions. In 1969, the talks for the landmark Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, started. In 1972, Richard Nixon, USA President, visited Moscow. In 1973, Leonid Brezhnev, the USSR leader, visited Washington. In 1974, Nixon visited Moscow. Finally, in 1975, the Helsinki Agreement, between the USA, USSR, Canada, and major European powers except European frontiers set up after World War II. This agreement recognized that Germany was divided and East European countries agreed to allow their people human rights such as freedom of speech. The key relations between each superpower. China and USA. USA had backed the Chinese nationalists in Taiwan since their fall in 1949 and had fought Communist China on behalf of the UN in the Korean War. In October 1971, China entered the UN. Presidents Nixon and Ford both visited China, though USA kept a massive naval fleet off Taiwan. In December 1978, America's President Carter withdrew recognition of Taiwan. China and Russia. Relations between these two nations had soured in the late 1950s over ideological matters. Both communist states accused the other of revisionism, or moving away from pure communism. Both clashed over their borders, and China has always asked for the return of land taken by the USSR in the C-19. The territorial issue combined with the ideological issue has done little to ease problems between the two, and both tried to develop better relationships with America than the other had.
The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, formally dissolved on the 26th of December 1991. The dissolution of the Soviet Union led to the establishment of 15 independent nations: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Moldova, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. On the previous day, the 25th of December 1991, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev had resigned and handed over power to Russian President Boris Yeltsin. The dissolution of the world's first and largest communist state marked the end of the Cold War. There were various factors that led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, including Mikhail Gorbachev's two policies of perestroika, openness, and glasnost, restructuring, ethnic tension within the Soviet Union, and the Baltic Uprising. In 1985, new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev began a process of increasing political liberalization in the communist one-party state. This included his two policies, perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. Perestroika allowed more economic freedom within the Soviet Union and allowed citizens to form small enterprises for profit. In addition, glasnost, openness, promoted more freedom in literature, press, and media. This allowed citizens to speak out more against the government and tolerated dissidents. However, these policies turned out to be failures, and the Soviet people suffered from poverty, hunger, and lack of opportunity. This liberalization led to the emergence of nationalist movements and ethnic disputes within the diverse republics of the Soviet Union. It led to the revolutions of 1989, which saw the toppling of Soviet-imposed communist regimes in the nations that were originally in the Warsaw Pact. Also, Baltic Uprising would eventually lead to nations known today as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. In addition, ethnic tension intensified all over the Soviet Union, especially in areas such as Karabakh, where Azeris committed unspeakable atrocities against the Armenians. The combination of all these factors led to increased discontent and violence, which put pressure on Gorbachev to introduce greater democracy and autonomy for the Soviet Union's republics. This discontent culminated in the August coup of 1991. The coup was carried out by 8 hardline members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, who were opposed to Gorbachev's reform program. Although successful at first, the coup eventually failed because Boris Yeltsin led an effective campaign of civil resistance. The coup collapsed in only 2 days and Gorbachev returned to government, but relinquished power to Boris Yeltsin on December 26, 1991. This event destabilized the Soviet Union, and is regarded as the focusing event that led to the dissolution of Soviet Union. The Soviet Union officially collapsed on December 25, 1991, which marked the end of the Cold War after 46 years of heightened conflict and tension. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like, share, comment, or subscribe, as it would be a great help and keep you notified of new content.
In this video, I will explore the Oslo Accords, which was a peace deal between the Palestine Liberation Organization and Israel. The Oslo Accords are a monumental accomplishment in contemporary international politics. Although peace still remains elusive more than 25 years later, it is nonetheless a huge step of progress. The Oslo Accords attempted to solve three main issues. 1. The expansion of Jewish settlements into Palestinian territory. 2. Ensuring Jerusalem remained a peaceful place for all faiths. And 3. Safety and minimizing terrorism surrounding the borders. On September 13, 1993, the PLO chairman Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin signed the Oslo Accords in Washington, D.C. in the presence of Bill Clinton. The Oslo Accords originated in discussions in Oslo, Norway between Mahmoud Abbas for the PLO and Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, with the U.S. Secretary of State Warren Christopher for the United States and Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrev for Russia attending. These meetings resulted in the Oslo Accords that were signed at the White House. The Accords established a 5-year period where negotiations between Israel and the PLO would increase and improve. The Accords called for the withdrawal of the Israel Defense Forces from parts of the Gaza Strip and West Bank and affirmed Palestinian right of self-rule and autonomy within these areas. The Accords provided for the creation of a Palestinian interim self-government, the Palestinian National Authority, PNA. The Palestinian Authority would have responsibility for the administration of the territory under its control. Major issues such as Jerusalem, Palestinian refugees, Israeli settlements, and security in borders were to be decided during the meetings. Although the Oslo Accords marked a monumental step between Palestinian-Israeli agreements, peace from the deal would not last. Groups on both sides disagreed with the Accords. As a result, terrorism from radical groups intensified, and suicide attacks and deaths significantly increased. Hamas emerged as a significant power in the region, and peace negotiations deteriorated. There were three fundamental issues that had not been resolved. First, the Jewish expansion of settlements in the West Bank continued. This was seen as a blatant disregard for peace and reconciliation despite the efforts established in Oslo. Second, the issue of Jerusalem remained a heated debate, and both sides believed it was their capital. Israel recognized Jerusalem as their capital, and settlements continued to be expanded in the West Bank. The Palestinians disagreed and believed it was their land. The third unresolved issue was the Palestinian people's right to return to their original land. This was a fundamental issue that remained unresolved after the Oslo Accords because heightened terrorism increased the security surrounding the borders. As a result, the Oslo Accords marked a big shift, but the many fundamental issues remained unresolved. Terrorism only increased as a result. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, share, comment, or subscribe, as it would be a great help and keep you notified of new content.